Cool, looks good. Hopefully it doesn't cut out as usual. Hi everyone, this is Max. I'm in Chicago with Nathan and Jordan. And today we're going to be reading Representation by Rosmarie Waldropvc. Representation. I have no conscience because I always chew my pencil. Can we say white paper with black lines on it is like a human body? This question, not to be decided by pointing at a tree, nor yet by a description of simple pleasures. Smell of retrieval led to expect the wrong answer. An arsenal without purpose, but why yes, please? There is no touching the black box. The tree not pointed at lives in your bringing up the subject and leaves space for need, falling. The white ground, the waning heat. I'd like to say the history of the world, or that grammar milks essence into propositions of human kindness. The difficulty here is not true or false, but that the picture's in the foreground and its sense back where the gestures link so closely to the bone. The words give notice. The application is not easy. All right, let's dive into this. Representation. Let's start with the title. What is the idea of representation doing in this poem? Let's just riff a little bit on representation as an idea. So my first question when I see that is representation of what? Like what is meant to be represented?
And there's a lot specifically about words and how they're used and how they could be used in here. And words are a way to represent something.
Sure. It seems mostly to be words, right? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking. Well, okay, so it gets pretty heady in the middle, but we'll get there. What she talks about a picture in a foreground, but that's different. Okay. Yeah, so representation, I think, comes up very clearly in the second sentence. Can we say white paper with black lines on it is like a human body? This is a classic problem of like a theory of representation, right? Like how is something like something? How does something represent something? How does a drawing, let's say like a pen and ink drawing, look like a human person, like a body? This is a very philosophical.
Yeah, and in this I think, since there's lines on the paper, in addition to drawing, is also when you write about it.
Yes.
And she's asking a question, so instead of taking sort of the like poetic trope of assuming metaphor or assuming analogy, there's this question, can we, which could either be like collaborative or asking for permission, or asking about the validity of it. So there's, I think, different ways it could be read, but there's some purpose for asking instead of just stating.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that she uses a simile and not a metaphor.
Can we say white papers with black lines on it is like a human body? Is that the simile you mean?
Yeah.
Rather than saying, can we say that it is a human body or something like that?
Maybe that's a nitpicky thing.
No, I think that that's important, because it's about representation and it's about like things being like things, and also because similes and metaphors are two different kinds of representation in a way.
And who is the we?
And so yeah, to go back to your point, Jordan, there's the way that she forms that question, can we say white paper with black lines on it is like a human body, right? It implies that there needs some consensus needs to be reached, right? What, I can say that, but can we together say this? Can we agree that it's like this?
So we would have to hold the same representation, or we have to agree to the same representation.
We have to agree that representation is possible. That white paper with black lines on it can be like a human body.
I mean, the phrase "chew my pencil." What does "chew my pencil" mean? Is that a metaphor? Does she mean that literally?
So I had bracketed that first sentence because it's really tricky. I have no conscience. Let's deal with it real quick since you brought it up, Nathan. I have no conscience because I always chew on my pencil. Does that mean? So yeah, chewing on the pencil, is it metaphorical? What does it mean? But also the whole sentence, I have no conscience because I always chew on my pencil. This
May I have your attention, please? Good afternoon. Please join us at 1 p.m. in room 8S14 on the 8th floor for an artist talk with Benjamin F. Calvert III to discuss his exhibit, I Spy, Source Process Image. Again, join us at 1 p.m. in room 8S14 on the 8th floor to learn about this exciting exhibit. Thank you.
Okay, so anyway, 3, 2, 1. I have no conscience because I always chew my pencil. There's a conditional or a cause and effect happening, but I don't really know how having no conscience follows from chewing one's pencil.
I think it's like intentionally super exaggerated. Like the way that I see this is the people that say if you fold the pages of your book, if you like dog ear them, then you can't possibly have any conscience because the book is this like sacred object or whatever. So if you think about it sort of as a statement like that, it's saying you take this small behavior that is either irreverent or somehow not ideal in like breaking things or making them not okay, and then blowing that out in a representational, like it's representation, right? Like people that do this XYZ small behavior must have no conscience or must have this bigger sort of moral failing associated with that.
I like that reading a lot. It's really interesting. And because it adds a different idea of representation into the mix from the get-go. Not just this idea of can white paper with black lines on it look like a human body, which is one idea of representation. But this another idea of representation as a sort of specific instance or thing or image being indicative of a larger whole or something, which is a slightly different idea and a little bit more difficult to think about. But I do like a lot what you said. People who chew on pencils, is the chewing of the pencil, does it represent something about their character, right? Which is what's happening in this sentence.
The phrase "chew my pencil," I'm kind of like, it's like, is this some word that everybody knows what it means? I just don't know what it means.
Did you get in trouble as a kid, like for chewing on your pens or chewing on your
But
pencils?
does it have like another?
Does it have like a
connotation or something? Like chew on one's pencil?
You should tell it, like, she speak.
Is it like an idiom?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think
She's just kind of inventing a brand new idiom.
I don't know. I think it's just super standard. Like I always, like in every elementary school class I was in, some kid got in trouble for chewing on their pencil. It's like a fidgety, unsanitary, destructive thing to do that people like to chastise kids about, and but it's not inherently bad in any way. So I just thought it's just sort of like the standard sort of behavior.
It's like some sort of, tells us something about somebody psychoanalytically. Like,
you're like
chewing on things that they're
compulsive or something, or like they have an oral fixation, I guess. Or have no conscience.
Or have no conscience. That or, being like a 10-year-old stuck in a room for 8 hours, one of the two.
Right.
Because, well, the first sentence to the words that I pick up on are no and always. I have no conscience because I always chew my pencil.
Mhm.
Okay.
This is not saying like I occasionally
Chew my pencil.
slip
Right.
or
I do it compulsively. I cannot help myself. I'm
I
always
sometimes have no conscience. This is like saying I have no conscience because I always chew my pencil.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, it's very like binary. Like,
Yeah.
I always do this, and I have no conscience. She's not saying I have a little bit of a conscience or.
Sure. And that goes for that also speaks, I think, to the sort of moralistic language here in some ways. I think the no and the always, right? I mean these things of like what you're always supposed to do or always not supposed to do, and whether or not that means you're a good or a bad person. Like this very binaristic, as you said. Like it sounds very moralizing to me, right? Like it's like, oh, I can't help myself. I chew my pencil. I can't. I'm compulsive. And thus that means I have no conscience and I'm a terrible person. Like this extremely heavy moral judgment.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have that kind of that first sentence with it's kind of like a more abstract form of representation, right? Of being like oh, because I do this I must be like this. And then there's that second question, can we agree to say, this other idea about representation, like we collectively agree that that words or drawing or that something on paper can represent something, right? But then she answers that question by saying, this question not to be decided by pointing at a tree, nor yet by a description of simple pleasures. This question not to be decided by pointing at, so the question's undecided. But not to be decided by pointing at a tree. Does anybody want to?
It's so interesting that she is like offering a metaphor and then saying that drawing a metaphor is not a way to address the question. Like, because pointing at something in order to understand something else is what a metaphor does.
Yes.
And
very good, yeah.
she's saying, so basically she's saying, hey, can we agree to this metaphor as having any sort of validity? And say, no, you can't decide that by bringing in another metaphor.
By pointing to something, by referring to something else, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the first sentence, the no and always are very absolute, and then the second sentence where she says white paper with black lines is like a human body, she uses a simile, which is a little bit less absolute, because it starts to invite, she didn't use a metaphor, she used a simile, so it starts to invite me to think, well, how is a white paper with black lines on it like a human body? How is it not like a human body?
Right.
It starts to get me to think in terms of degrees or various levels.
That's a great reading of
Yeah.
the simile for sure. But
Yeah.
I think that starts to answer why she used a simile rather than a metaphor, which was something we were pondering a couple minutes ago, right?
So it's not it's like she's saying on the one hand, is it a set of extremes where it's all one thing or all the other? The second sentence is like, well, no, it's maybe various.
Yeah, the simile seems to be more. Similes seem to function more in degrees, right? Like something can be a lot more like something or less like something, as you just said.
Like in some ways, but not in others, or not all the time. Then the third sentence, she just uses the word question. So it raises a question,
That's yeah.
Is life or is representation a metaphor, or is it a simile? Or is it like real absolute and clear and always universal? Or is it a little bit more nuanced, and that representation has various ways where it works, or it's clear and it's absolute, and other times where it's a little bit less clear, more ambiguous, uncertain, open to interpretation or nuance or discussion.
So the tree, Jordan, you suggested that the tree is just, it's a way of, it seems to be introducing something that has nothing to do with the conversation, right?
It
So
could
it's a
or
way of, like,
couldn't. I see it like two different ways. I mean, pointing at a tree, pointing at nature is like an easy sort of like trope of metaphors. But also, I mean, this might be too far, but if we're talking about paper and we're pointing at a tree to try and answer it, like paper is made of trees. So I wonder if there's some sort of like lineage involved in the image as well. But
that's fantastic. I love that reading of paper back to the tree, and also just how that implies another form of representation of something being like something, right? Like she throws us off by being like, there's the paper with the lines on it, and the drawing is the representation, or the words are the representation, right? And then she's like, well, what about the actual paper itself? Like is this a representation of a tree? Is this kind of like another? Is this like a little piece of tree that makes us think of all trees? It's an interesting way of like further complicating it. Yeah, that's great. For me, the tree, and I don't know if this was just like an example that I encountered, and it's not terribly common, but it seemed common to me at the time. I took a linguistics class, and tree was an example that was used to illustrate the arbitrariness between language and what language refers to, because there's nothing in the word tree that suggests treeness, right? Like tree is just a strange word, and there's nothing in that sound or the letters that have anything to do with a tree as a thing. So I remember that being an example of that phenomenon in linguistics, using tree specifically because it's true. It's a very weird thing that we have decided, and then every language has a completely different word for tree, right? I mean, as they do for most words, it's just trees. It's a very convenient example. There's not even like a sonic thing like sometimes there is in some like more onomatopoeic words. Like I don't know, I'm trying to think of a word that like
buzz.
Like buzz, yeah. Right. Where you can be like, oh yeah, the sound. There's some quality of the thing it refers to in the sound of the language, right? But not with tree at all. So I think I don't know. For me, tree there introduces this linguistic problem, or this sort of semantic semiological problem of how does language mean nothing? Like how does the word tree make us think of trees? How does that happen? Which for me actually continues into the next stanza. Smell of retrieval led to expect the wrong answer. An arsenal without purpose, but why yes? Smell of retrieval. What is that?
That like isn't a thing. Like you can't smell.
You can't smell retrieval. The smell of retrieval.
It's like a thing you cannot smell.
Yeah, it's true. Retrieval has absolutely no smell.
Unless it's like sensory recall or something, but that's. I don't know.
Right. I remember the day that I was retrieving something and it smelled like whatever that day.
Or like smelling something makes you remember something.
Right.
But that's not the smell of retrieval, that's a smell triggering retrieval.
Right.
Retrieval itself does not smell.
No, not necessarily. But
So like maybe it's how do you, like if you like take something like retrieval and you try to figure out how to represent it, and you like go through the catalog of 5 senses and like you pick the one that is like the least question of like, how do the senses help represent something that cannot be reasonably represented
Right.
by X number of senses? Probably can't taste it either, you know?
Well, it raises the question of the senses, you know, and, you know, that second stanza, I just, for some reason, I go to black box and I circle that, and what does black box mean?
Yeah.
Some complicated thing that we just don't understand,
Yeah.
fully understand.
It's impenetrable,
It's,
right?
it's like top secret. I gotta be highly trained and authorized and talented and all the above, and it's only accessible to like a small number of people, or if anybody. I don't know what she means by the black box, but it's like, I mean, so, you know, representation is kind of something that's impenetrable or hard to understand or top secret, or this is like really hard stuff.
Like you can't get at it even though you try. Like could you literally touch the black box? Sure, but are you like actually getting anything out of it? No. So if you think you're representing, are you actually achieving representation?
For me, retrieval, just to continue with the linguistic thing, because trees totally triggered for me. There's the idea of retrieving of the signifier in the language, retrieving the signifier. So like you have to, when you see the word tree, you have to retrieve the idea of tree. And then that kind of continues with this like this sort of idea of that being a kind of black box process of being sort of very mysterious and impenetrable process, right? Like that something happens that you can't quite understand or access. Because she continues with the tree. The tree not pointed at lives in your bringing up the subject and leaves space for need, falling.
So she's doing a lot here with the words too, because retrieval has tree in it.
Oh,
so
yeah,
those are, I think that's intentional. And then when she's talking about the tree, like you almost want that to read and space for leaves falling.
Yes, exactly.
So that's there too, even though that might not be what is like explicitly being said.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's what she's doing with the sound of the language is really cool. The retrieval, the tree there, the sound of tree, echoing back to tree. There's the leaves, like the leaves of the tree. There's leaves with its slight echo with lives. The tree had pointed at lives, and you're bringing up the subject of leaves, space for need. Falling.
And it's like you're signifying, because the tree that's pointed at and the tree not pointed at is a different type of tree. So like even when we say tree, we still don't actually know what that's referring to. We
Right.
Think about how what we are referencing when we say
Right.
tree.
The tree not pointed at. So if we think about this pointing to the tree, which is a sort of like referential thing, and that this is a common thing that we talk about in Oddpo, right? With the referential language, like pointing to things. So we're talking about here a tree that's not pointed at. So you have the thing, the concept, or the image existing without its referent, like without something like referring to it. The tree not pointed at lives, and you're bringing up this subject and leaves space for need, falling back. I don't know what that means.
So maybe so it's not pointed at. So you brought up something, but you're not referencing the right thing, and that's the tree not pointed at because it's not being referenced. So there's space there, and there's a need there, which is what isn't being represented, or that's the failure of the representation that wants to be resolved.
Can you say that again? I think that sounded good.
So if we're,
spend some time with that.
so there's the tree that you're pointing at when you bring up the subject, but then there's the tree that you're not pointing at,
Yeah.
and that also exists, it lives, but it lives in sort of this like negative space
Mhm.
of maybe what the actual representation is, and so there's this need for the representation, so there's that space that needs to get filled.
Mhm.
There's stuff we don't know about or we don't understand or we're not highlighting, and yet it exists.
Mhm.
And so you have to somehow leave the space for that need. And
Mhm.
what does the word falling mean? Falling leaves? I mean, it's gonna have a life or an ecosystem of its own, even though you're not pointing out to it.
Leave space for need.
Is the tree falling?
I don't know,
Oh, well.
intentionally vague. I think of like leaves falling.
The leaves falling, the tree falling.
Because the tree not pointed at lives here, leaves space, falling. So I think grammatically the tree could be falling.
Could be either, it's like part of that black box thing. It's hard to decipher. I mean, we could be being led to expect the wrong thing, at the beginning. Retrieval is kind of like a complicated, deceiving thing. If the mind is primed with the word leaves space for need, falling, we might think of leaves, because that's what our mind was just primed for. But,
Mhm.
could be the tree falling. Could be the reader or the human falling.
Falling, yeah. It's an interesting thing that she tacks onto that sentence there. Falling.
And then right after she goes to the ground.
Yeah, right. So we have this like going to the ground thing. The white ground. The waning heat. The white ground, the waning heat. I'd like to say the history of the world. And that I'd like to say the history of the world. There's this callback to that second line. Can we say? So there's this idea of the we saying versus the I saying. There's the same hesitation. Like, can we say this? And she'd also be like, I'd like to say this. There's the same hesitation around like saying. I'm not entirely sure why. I'd like to say the history.
Or why she can't say the history of the world. Like why she isn't saying it if it's
Right.
something she wants to say. Is
Right.
it because the history can't be, like, because the history, like, she doesn't know it or it can't be known, or, like, what are the reasons she's not?
I think that she doesn't have a word for it the way that there's a word for tree. Right? Like, I'd like to say the history, I'd like to be able to say this word that means the history of the world. But
Oh.
that word doesn't exist. I mean, we can say the history of the world, but that doesn't make you think of a thing the way the tree does, right? And I don't think that I think in that case she's using the example of tree earlier not to be like, oh, a tree is something that we have like a language for.